She said I had to get off the plane immediately. Her words cut through the cabin hum like a sharp knife. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe, couldn't even move. The murmurs of other passengers seemed to dull into a muffled drone, as if the world itself had paused. My hands, resting limply on the armrests, began to tremble, and the heat of shame crept slowly up my neck, stinging my ears. I didn't know that moment would change everything. I didn't know how quickly a whisper could shift the ground beneath me, how authority could turn suddenly into judgment, and how powerless one could feel, even in the middle of a crowded plane. My name is Eleanor. I'm 63, and I've flown more miles than I can count, but never have I felt so exposed, so small. The leather of the seat pressed against my back, the dull metallic taste of recycled air in my mouth, the rhythmic drone of the engines, it all seemed suddenly too loud, too sharp, too aware of my embarrassment. I felt every eye that flickered toward me, every subtle glance that passed between strangers, and I wished, desperately, to disappear into the cushions beneath me. The flight attendant leaned closer, and I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, lavender, crisp and clean, like she had prepared for this confrontation, and she repeated it, softer this time, but no less urgent. You have to leave now. No one spoke up for me. No one offered a questioning glance or even a flicker of hesitation. The betrayal wasn't just in her words. It was in the silence surrounding them. I realized, with a pang that cut deeper than any insult, that sometimes the world allows injustice to pass quietly. I stood slowly, deliberately, keeping my movements measured. No shouting, no pleading, just a calm dignity that I forced into each step. And as I walked down the aisle, head held high, I smiled faintly to myself. I had made one call earlier, and that call, though no one knew it yet, would shift the balance of this moment entirely. Do you understand why? Let me take you back. I sank back into my seat, though the weight of what had just happened made it impossible to truly settle. My hands rested in my lap, trembling slightly, fingers curling and uncurling, as if they had their own nervous rhythm. A teacup on the tray in front of me rattled with every subtle movement, its porcelain clinking softly against the edge like a tiny alarm I could not silence. The cabin remained alive with ordinary sounds, engines humming steadily, the soft shuffle of passengers adjusting themselves, the faint murmur of conversations, but none of it reached me. Each sound felt distant, almost as though I were underwater, trapped in a bubble of disbelief and quiet panic. Every glance that flickered in my direction from nearby passengers was quickly averted. No one spoke. No one offered a questioning look, a pause, or even a hesitant word of comfort. I didn't want to draw attention, yet I couldn't shake the awareness of every silent observer. Their eyes carried a mix of curiosity and discomfort, but never concern. And in that stillness, I felt the sharp sting of isolation. Sometimes, the world watches silently while injustice occurs, and even in a crowded place, you can feel utterly alone. I breathed in slowly, tasting the faint metallic tang of recycled air, trying to calm the surge of heat rising to my cheeks. Outside the tiny oval windows, the clouds drifted lazily, indifferent to the turmoil within the cabin. The faint shiver of the plane passing through a pocket of turbulence made the cup rattle again, and I realized my pulse had synchronized with it, hammering quietly against my ribs. And yet, in the midst of that quiet, disbelieving panic, I felt a small ember of resolve. I would not crumble here. Not in front of these silent witnesses, not under the weight of their passive judgment. I straightened slightly, took a deep breath, and reminded myself this moment did not define me. I only had to wait, quietly, and let the next move unfold. I noticed him across the aisle before I could stop myself, one of the few passengers who had been watching the exchange closely. His eyes flickered toward mine for the briefest instant, and then he looked away, as if my presence were an inconvenient truth he preferred to ignore. Shadows from the dim overhead lamp cut across his face, making half of him disappear into darkness. The contrast made his avoidance feel deliberate, calculated even, and a chill ran down my spine. A suitcase rolled by on the floor with a sudden jolt, punctuating the racing beat of my own heart. Each click of the wheels against the aisles seemed impossibly loud, echoing the emptiness of the empathy I had hoped to find. My pulse synchronized with that rhythm, each thud a reminder that even in the middle of this cabin filled with people, I was entirely exposed. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply observed the slight crease between his brows, the way he adjusted his seatbelt with nervous precision, the careful avoidance of my gaze. And in that silent, almost mundane act, I realized how fragile trust could be. Even strangers, the ones I'd assumed impartial, could become bystanders to betrayal. Retreating silently while injustice unfolded, the hum of the engine seemed to grow louder. A low, vibrating reminder that the plane would not pause for my discomfort. The faint scent of coffee from a nearby cup mingled with the recycled air, creating a surreal juxtaposition of normalcy and fear. I had survived many flights, many moments of minor anxiety, but never had I felt so entirely unprotected, and yet, in the quiet observation of this stranger's avoidance, a small, stubborn clarity emerged. Betrayal, I realized, is not always loud. Sometimes it is the absence of action, the choice to look away, to avoid seeing what is unfolding before you. I rested my hands in my lap again, steadying the slight tremor, and reminded myself that this silent witness, like so many others, would not dictate my response. My resolve was mine alone. My hands gripped the armrests as if they could anchor me against the roar of the engines. Each vibration through the cabin seemed amplified, a tremor I could feel in my fingertips, in my teeth, and the pit of my stomach. Outside, the thin curtains at the window fluttered with the wind, casting shadows across my lap like silent reminders of the turbulence both around and within me. I kept replaying the flight attendant's whisper over and over in my mind. "You have to get off now." Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet beneath it lingered a sharp edge of authority that demanded compliance. I questioned myself endlessly. Should I have listened? Should I have nodded, stood up, and left? Was my refusal an act of courage or foolishness? The metallic tang of recycled air filled my lungs, each breath reminding me of my own vulnerability. I had thought my years, my experience, my calm demeanor would shield me from humiliation or error. Yet here I was, feeling exposed, uncertain, questioning every decision that led me to this moment. Regret gnawed quietly, like a persistent undertone in the steady hum of the engines. The cabin lights flickered softly, briefly illuminating the anxious expressions of nearby passengers. No one reached out. No hand offered comfort or guidance. I realized how cruel hindsight could be, how vivid the replay of a single moment could become when it was colored by doubt. Each syllable of her whisper resonated differently in my mind now, twisting and shifting, as though I were trying to read meaning where none could be found. And yet, despite the swirl of guilt and self-recrimination, a stubborn ember of resolve remained. I would not allow this moment nor my own second-guessing to define me. The quiet determination settled over me like a soft, heavy shawl. I exhaled slowly, steadying my pulse. In the roar of engines and flutter of curtains, I reminded myself, mistakes and doubts are inevitable, but how I rise afterward, that is my choice. I tried to focus on my breathing, tried to convince myself that the world was ordinary and predictable. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed it. Subtle gestures from the crew, tiny exchanges of glances that didn't belong to routine service. Their voices were barely above a murmur, punctuated by the clink of cutlery or the soft rustle of napkins. Yet in those quiet motions, attention lingered, something deliberate, calculated. The ticking clock at the galley seemed impossibly loud now, each second hammering at my awareness. Tick, tick, tick. It was as if the machinery of this small, contained world was revealing its secrets to me second by second. I could feel my pulse synchronize with it, slow and deliberate, drawing my attention to every minuscule detail. A tray shifted against the metal cart. A hand paused mid-air, fingers curling slightly around a coffee pot. Eyes flickered. Nothing was overt, nothing shouted, but my gut told me this was no accident. Not everything is as it seems. Someone always has a plan. And I had walked, unprepared, right into the perimeter of it. I looked around, seeing the familiar cabin in a new light. The soft hum of the engines, the muted overhead lights, the passengers, who seemed oblivious to the silent chess game unfolding around them. Even the fluttering of a curtain, the faint aroma of coffee took on the weight of possible intent. I realized then that I could no longer sit as a passive observer. This wasn't just about the whispered command earlier. Something deeper was at play. A subtle orchestration of events that had already begun to shape my fate. Every tiny gesture, every muted conversation, felt like a thread in a web, and I knew instinctively that I had to act or risk being ensnared. I adjusted my posture, hands resting calmly on my lap, outwardly composed. Inside, however, my mind was alert, scanning, calculating. Awareness was my first weapon, observation my shield. The quiet hum of the engines and the ticking of the galley clock became my allies, marking the rhythm of the invisible plot that now demanded my full attention. I kept my hand still in my lap, my eyes scanning the brief shadows cast by the flickering lights. Every glance exchanged between crew members, every slight hesitation, seemed meaningful, deliberate. I felt the slow tightening of awareness coil around me like a rope, urging caution but also awakening a quiet curiosity. The plane's engines thrummed beneath me, steady and unyielding, and I realized that in this web of whispered secrets, I was both participant and observer. I did not yet understand the full shape of what was coming, but I knew instinctively that every move, every subtle decision, carried weight. I breathed slowly, deliberately, tasting the mingled air of fear and coffee, and reminded myself that the quiet observation of hidden truths is often the first step toward claiming control. I had convinced myself that at least a few eyes would remain allies, that somewhere among the passengers, someone would notice my plight and offer the tiniest hint of solidarity. But then I saw him, a man I had shared a brief conversation with earlier, whose smile had seemed kind, whose nod had seemed reassuring. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and instead of concern, I caught a smirk, a deliberate, dismissive curl of the lips, and then he looked away, as though my presence were an inconvenience he wanted nothing to do with. The engine's hum deepened, a low, ominous thrum that seemed to echo the sudden hollow ache in my chest. Shock rippled through me, followed swiftly by hurt I hadn't anticipated. Betrayal often comes from the people you least expect, I realized, and sometimes it arrives not with a confrontation but with the cold absence of support. The cabin felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the betrayal had condensed around me, pressing at my shoulders and making it difficult to breathe. I gripped the armrests again, steadying myself, but my mind raced. Every detail now held weight: the tilt of a head, the slight pause in conversation, the way a hand lingered over a magazine rather than offering help. I had trusted him, even in the smallness of our prior interaction, and that trust had been, quietly, irreversibly broken. The flickering overhead light cast shifting shadows across the aisle. The reflection of the sun glinting off the wing outside seemed distant and irrelevant, a cruel reminder that life continued even as small betrayals reshaped it entirely. I could feel my pulse, rapid but contained, a reminder that while others could disappoint me, my own composure remained untouchable. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension settle like dust in the cabin air. This betrayal, like the whisper that had started it all, would not define me. I would watch, I would wait, and when the moment was right, I would reclaim the balance quietly, deliberately, on my own terms. I rested my hands on the soft fabric of my coat, letting the texture ground me. The faint hum of the engines and the distant shuffle of passengers became a backdrop to the stillness I deliberately cultivated. My pulse, once a rapid drum of panic, began to slow, settling into a quiet rhythm that felt like mine alone. The dim cabin lamp cast long, stretching shadows over my fingers, emphasizing the smallness of my movements yet giving weight to every thought that ran through my mind. In that suspended moment, I felt a clarity I hadn't known during the chaos of the earlier whisper. The betrayal, the smirks, the hushed conversations, they all faded to the periphery as I focused inward. Calm moments allow for decisive action, I reminded myself, and this pause was not weakness but preparation. Each breath became intentional, each blink measured, as if the cabin itself had conspired to grant me this brief space of lucidity. I glanced toward the crew, noting the subtle signs again, the slight stiffening of posture, the low murmurs, the careful avoidance of my gaze. I understood now that they were part of a system, a network of quiet control that depended on my uncertainty. But in this stillness, I realized the system could be observed, understood, and if handled with precision, subtly disrupted. Outside the window, the ocean reflected the sun in ripples that danced and shimmered, indifferent to the turbulence within the cabin. The contrast was calming. The vast, unchanging horizon reminded me that no moment, no whispered threat, no silent betrayal could consume my entire world. I allowed a faint smile to touch my lips, barely perceptible but wholly deliberate. The stage was set, the pieces visible. When the time came, I would act, quietly and with full awareness, turning the tension that had cornered me into my own advantage. For now, I waited, embracing the calm as my ally. I felt the tiny weight of my phone in my pocket and allowed my fingers to brush against it lightly, testing the familiar edges, feeling the power it represented. The crew continued their hushed conversations, oblivious to the small act of defiance taking shape in my hands. With careful subtlety, I lifted the device just enough to send a message, a single, deliberate gesture that no one else would notice. The muffled sound of my ringtone barely rose above the cabin hum, swallowed by the steady drone of the engines. Yet to me, it was the signal of control, the quiet confirmation that I was no longer entirely at the mercy of circumstances or those who sought to intimidate me. Relief surged through me in a muted wave, private and contained, like a flame flickering unseen beneath a table. Passengers shifted, the faint scrape of a seatbelt, the shuffle of a shoe, but none were aware that a small shift had occurred. A subtle victory, a reclamation of agency, had been achieved without confrontation, without raising a voice. It was the kind of triumph that could only be felt inwardly, a secret satisfaction carried quietly within. I let my gaze wander out the window. The ocean reflected patches of sunlight, shimmering in fragmented patterns across the plane's wing. The movement of the waves was slow, hypnotic, and it reminded me that life continued beyond the immediate tension, that control could exist even in the smallest gestures. Even as the crew whispered and glanced at one another, I remained composed, outwardly calm, inwardly empowered. Victory is sometimes quiet, uncelebrated, and yet profoundly satisfying. It requires no applause, no recognition, only the understanding that, for the moment, you have claimed what is rightfully yours, the awareness that you are still in charge of yourself. I lowered my hand slowly, letting the phone rest again in my pocket, savoring the stillness that followed, knowing that the first move had been made, and the subtle balance was beginning to tip in my favor. I noticed it almost immediately, the subtle shift in the crew's demeanor. Flight attendants exchanged glances, quick and loaded, as if sensing that the carefully maintained rhythm of the cabin had faltered. Their whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a cautious stillness. The air itself seemed to pulse differently, charged with an undercurrent of uncertainty that I could feel in the gentle brush of the cabin wind against my cheek. A curtain near the exit shifted in the airflow, giving me a fleeting, cinematic view of their faces. Eyes widened slightly, lips pressed together, brows furrowed in calculation. The moment was brief, almost imperceptible, yet I understood the significance. Something I had done, small, silent, almost invisible, had disrupted the expected order. I remained still, composed, letting the subtle tremors of tension play out around me. The hum of the engine seemed louder now, almost as if echoing the invisible ripple I had sent through the cabin. Passengers remained unaware, absorbed in their own routines, but the crew knew. I could sense their hesitation, They were calculating minds, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction. Outside, the sun reflected off the ocean, shimmering in muted brilliance across the wing. The contrast between the serene vastness below and the tension above only heightened the cinematic intensity of the moment. My pulse remained steady, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I didn't need to speak. No one needed to acknowledge me. Quiet defiance, subtle and deliberate, had already begun to assert itself. I allowed myself a small exhale, tasting the mingled air of relief and anticipation. The first tremors of control had shifted in my favor, and though the conflict was far from over, I had discovered a powerful truth. In the silence of observation and the subtlety of action, even one person can unsettle a system built to intimidate. I slid my hand lightly over my phone, fingertips brushing the screen as if it were an extension of my own resolve. With a quiet, deliberate motion, I tapped a message to my contact, sending it out into the unseen world beyond the cabin. The dim lamp above me cast a soft glow over my face, highlighting the calm confidence I had cultivated over the past tense hours. There was no tremor in my hands, no hint of panic, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows the power of measured action. The crew continued their subtle movements, whispering among themselves, unaware that the invisible balance was shifting. I felt a small, private thrill, not of malice, but of reclamation. Every gesture, every glance they exchanged, carried the weight of their confusion, and I remained serene, poised, untouchable. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly, the sunlight fractured into 1,000 glimmers across the waves, a cinematic backdrop to my quiet maneuvering. The plane hummed steadily beneath me, a persistent reminder of both confinement and freedom. In that moment, I realized the potency of subtlety. Revenge need not be loud, need not be dramatic. Sometimes the most powerful justice is silent, strategic, and unseen until it is fully realized. I allowed myself a slow, controlled exhale, feeling the tension release from my shoulders. The message had been sent. The first ripple of consequence was in motion. I didn't need anyone's acknowledgement, didn't crave the satisfaction of immediate recognition. My secret was my leverage, my silent triumph, and it was enough. In that dimly lit cabin, amidst the whispers, the hum of engines, and the flickering lights, I smiled faintly to myself. The scales were beginning to tilt. Quietly, deliberately, I had taken back control of the situation, and no one, not even the orchestrators of my earlier humiliation, would see it coming until it was too late. The whispers grew louder, tinged, now with unease. Crew members exchanged furtive glances, their movements sharper, more deliberate, as though they sensed the invisible thread of change weaving through the cabin. I remained seated, outwardly composed, my hands resting lightly on my lap, though inside a quiet satisfaction began to bloom. From somewhere beyond the cabin, muffled voices reached my ears, indistinct, urgent, carrying the subtle authority of intervention. The sound of rolling wheels punctuated the hum of conversation and engines, a rhythm that hinted at decisive action taking place just out of sight. I allowed myself a small, measured smile. The shift I had set in motion was beginning to manifest, quietly, efficiently, without any spectacle. Passengers remained largely unaware, absorbed in their own routines, while the orchestrators of my earlier intimidation became entangled in their own confusion. Their hushed whispers carried the unmistakable note of concern, a delicate tremor betraying that the balance of control had changed. I felt a flicker of triumph, not of malice but of justice restored. The dim cabin lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows that danced across the aisle. Each subtle movement of the crew, each whispered exchange, underscored the silent but undeniable impact of my intervention. I realized then that confrontation does not always require volume or fury. Sometimes the quiet, deliberate act of reclaiming agency speaks louder than any outburst. Outside the window, the ocean shimmered with shifting reflections of sunlight, a calm and indifferent witness to the scene unfolding above it. The contrast between the serene horizon and the charged energy inside the cabin heightened the cinematic intensity of the moment. I settled back into my seat, pulse steady, hands relaxed. Just as I understood, had arrived not with fanfare, but in a subtle, unseen way that left the orchestrators of my humiliation bewildered. I had claimed my dignity quietly, deliberately, and it was more satisfying than any dramatic vindication could ever be. The plane's door opened, and a rush of cool air greeted me, brushing gently against my face. It smelled faintly of ozone and fuel, but also carried the subtle sweetness of relief, a tangible contrast to the tension that had gripped me for hours. Each step down the narrow aisle felt like shedding a layer of the anxiety and fear that had weighed so heavily in the cabin. Passengers moved past, chattering quietly, their expressions a blur of indifference and preoccupation. A small lamp in the terminal flickered, casting warm light over the polished floors, creating long, soft shadows that mirrored the ones I had endured inside. I noticed the way the breeze tugged at my coat, the gentle sway of my hair, and I felt the simple, profound pleasure of being in control of my own body again. I paused for a moment on the threshold, allowing the scene to settle around me. The subtle rhythm of rolling suitcases, murmured greetings, and the distant announcement of departing flights. Relief settled like a gentle weight in my chest, a quiet acknowledgement of what I had endured and what I had reclaimed. The soft pride was not loud or demonstrative, but it was there, steady and unmistakable, flowing quietly beneath my calm exterior. I thought of the cabin, of the whispered threats, the small betrayals, and the tension that had tightened like a coil around me. Each moment had tested me, challenged the strength of my patience and the depth of my resolve. And yet, stepping into the open air, I realized that strength is measured not in shouts or confrontation, but in quiet endurance. The ability to hold one's dignity, even when the world seems poised to take it, is a triumph in itself. I walked slowly through the terminal, feeling each footstep, each breath, grounding myself in the ordinary world that had always waited beyond the cabin walls. The ocean wind, the flickering lamp, the murmur of life around me, they reminded me that I had survived, that I had endured, and that my quiet strength remained untarnished. I stood by the terminal window, watching the plane shrink into the distance, its silhouette etched against the soft glow of the horizon. The engine's hum had long faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of the world beyond, yet the memory of the cabin, the whispers, the silent betrayals, the tension remained vivid in my mind. I let my gaze linger on the fading aircraft, letting the distance between it and me mark the distance I had reclaimed within myself. The ocean wind swept past, brushing against my cheeks, tussling my hair, and carrying with it a faint saltiness that reminded me of life's vast, unyielding continuity. Betrayal, I realized, may come swiftly, sharply, and from the least expected quarters. But just as surely, life goes on, indifferent yet generous, giving room to heal, reflect, and regain one's own balance. I felt the quiet weight of wisdom settle over me. Every tremor of fear, every pang of doubt, every moment of humiliation had been a teacher. They had tested my patience, my dignity, my quiet courage. And though the lessons had been hard, they had been instructive. That strength is measured not in loud retaliation but in composure, that power often resides in subtle action, and that the dignity we preserve quietly is a victory no one can take from us. Passengers bustled around me, rushing toward gates, pulling luggage, absorbed in their own journeys. I let the small chaos unfold around me, feeling a calm, almost cinematic detachment. My pulse was steady, my shoulders relaxed, my hands free. I carried no bitterness, only reflection, only the knowledge that I had navigated the turbulence with grace, even when the world had tried to undermine me. Life tests you in silence, often when no one else is watching, but dignity is forever. I breathed deeply, letting the wind carry away the remnants of tension, and smiled softly to myself. At 30,000 feet and beyond, I had learned that quiet endurance, careful observation, and measured action were enough to reclaim the narrative and perhaps, in some subtle, unspoken way, to master it.